This episode of the Troxel Podcast is made possible with support from ArchIT. Are you tired of standard IT services that miss the mark? Choose ArchIT for specialized, proactive IT management, BIM support, and robust data security tailored for architects. Whether you're a team of 10 or a growing firm of 50 plus, ArchIT understands the architecture industry and will empower your unique creative vision to enable you to do your best work. Embrace a technology team that enhances, not hinders, your design process. Visit getarchit.com for your free IT assessment and start transforming your firm and your tech experience today. That's getarchit.com. Welcome to the Troxel Podcast. I am Evan Troxel, and today I welcome back Geoff Manaugh to this special Campfire Series episode of the podcast. Geoff is a Los Angeles-based freelance writer covering topics related to cities, design, crime, infrastructure, technology, and more for the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Wired, The New Yorker, The Guardian, The Financial Times Magazine, New Scientist, Cabinet Magazine, The Daily Beast, Wired UK, and many other publications. He is also the co-author with journalist Nicola Twilley of Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine, which was published during the pandemic in 2021. And in 2016, he published A Burglar's Guide to the City on the relationship between crime and architecture. He also writes fictional stories that have been adapted into films, like his ghost story titled Ernest and We Have a Ghost, which can be found on Netflix. Now, if you heard that and are thinking, that doesn't sound like the normal type of guest for the show, you'd be wrong, because Geoff has already been on the podcast. In this episode, we go off the beaten path and reflect on 20 years of BLDGBLOG, which is Geoff's blog, and the evolution of online writing. Geoff launched his blog on July 7th, 2004, and I invited him back after last speaking with him 4 years ago in episode number 8 to talk about this rare internet milestone. He recently put up an Instagram post that prompted me to reach out to him and catch up, and in that post he snarkily said, "Wild to think it's been 20 years. I genuinely miss the camaraderie and friendship of the earlier phase of the internet, replaced today by an online culture so cynical and empty and sloganeering and pointlessly embittered on every level. Alas." And while that's true, Geoff and I continue to endeavor in creating valuable material for our audiences, and I've been a huge fan of his work for a very long time. I also thought it was appropriate as we find ourselves completely buried in AI-generated content found online today. And so as we delve into today's conversation, Geoff provides valuable insights into maintaining an online presence while playing, or perhaps more appropriately, abstaining from participating in the algorithm games of social media, the topic of content ownership, and the shift from traditional blogging to modern platforms like Substack. We get into the creative opportunities of blending architecture with other disciplines explored by Geoff, learn about his journey from blogger to author, his Hollywood experiences with his fictional writing, and upcoming projects, including a new book on archaeology. As always, my ask of you is to help the show by subscribing to Troxel on YouTube and in your favorite podcast app to let me know that you're a fan. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please click that like button that's right down below. And if you'd like to get an email when episodes are published with all the links and other information from the episode, sign up at trxl.co. You can also directly support the show by becoming a member at the site as well. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Okay, so now without further ado, grab a beverage, pull up a chair, and gather around the campfire as we celebrate 2 decades of BLDGBLOG in my wide-ranging conversation with Geoff Manaugh. Geoff, welcome back. It's been 4 years, almost to the day, since you were on the podcast. You were a very early guest, so this is a little bit of a reunion, but it's an even bigger reunion of your blog turning 20 years old, which, okay, so I'm thinking about blogs in terms of timelines, and this is kind of geologic time for a blog. And
Sure.
You're super into geology and architecture and all these things too, so maybe that's fitting. What do you think?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's funny to think of my online writing as geologically aged, but yeah, in today's climate, that seems accurate. Yeah, 20 years is an extremely long time for a blog, especially because I mean, blogs as such now are, been replaced by newsletters and TikTok and even just longer posts on social media like Twitter and or Blue Sky, even for that matter. But
Yeah,
so yeah, it's funny to look back and realize that it was 20 years ago this month that I first put anything up on the website. And
that's
the fact
right.
that you and I
So
spoke nearly 4 years ago is also pretty and amazing.
I think I've also been blogging for about that time, but not in one place. Like I've always been like searching for, so there was Posterous and there was Tumblr and there was the .mac blog and there was Blogger, and I've been on all those. And then I eventually kind of settled into where I was recently at Squarespace for a long time, and now I'm on Ghost. But I like moving this stuff around is not easy for one.
Yeah.
How have you found the whole like, because ultimately you have a catalog of posts, you have books worth of posts, right? And it's like to have like the kotkey.orgs out there where it is a 20 plus year compendium of writing and stuff where it actually is all in one place. Maybe there was some foresight there. I don't know. Did you plan ahead for longevity with this, or what were you thinking?
I mean, I don't necessarily know how much I was thinking about genuine longevity, but I did think that the organizational pleasure of having all of my writing in one spot, and that you would know where to find it, and that it was a single URL that you could visit, and I would just have basically an online portfolio of writing that I could direct people to, was definitely a conscious decision. There were aspects of articles that I've written that to this day, even though I'm way less prolific on Building Blog than I used to be. But where I still kind of want to take old articles and just put them on Building Blog, just simply to literally have them all in one spot, to republish them there. But yeah, I think it's great actually to have one's writing in one place. There are a lot of people who I know who, similar to the description that you just gave of your own trajectory, they've got writing all over the internet at different websites, and some are defunct, sort of groups that don't exist anymore, or longer posts that they don't necessarily link to on sites like Archinect or that kind of thing. But yeah, having everything in one spot is great. The migration, I did actually change it at one point. I started Building Blog on Blogger, which was pretty at the time was great because it was free and I didn't feel any obligation whatsoever to post, because it wasn't I had no money and tied up in the venture. But around 2015, I think it was, I switched to WordPress. And the migration, my friend Jim Webb, who's a web guy in Washington, D.C., was a huge help with that. But migrating, I think I've deleted a lot of posts, but I think that there were something like 1,600 posts that I had to migrate over from the old Building Blog to get to the new one on WordPress. And then, there were some issues there too, just because every once in a while I'll reuse a title. Like, for example, I used to have a series of posts called Books Received, and it was just about books that I'm reading or books that have been sent to me for reviews. But I found only after going back through my website on WordPress that WordPress, the migration tool that we used, had mixed up the books received, so that like a books received written in 2009 had been replaced by one written in 2014. And then I had to go back and figure out which ones were which, and it wasn't very fun, but that's a minor issue. When the reward is that you have a place that you can post and you can get your voice out there and participate in the larger architecture culture. So, the headaches are worth it.
It's interesting to think of now with new context around ownership of your own stuff, right? So, I mean, to your point a minute ago, right? Blogging on other platforms like Medium or even on LinkedIn now, people put up longer articles. Yeah. And they're not ours, right? Even Substack to a certain, it's your Substack, but it's still on Substack, right? And there's a reason people go to those platforms if they want to monetize their writing and have it behind a paywall or have subscriptions or whatever. But for you to have your own place that it's yours, right? I think is kind of an interesting. It's a great thing to have. Like I own mine too, but the idea of having it all under your control is, I think, something of value. But it's also not where the eyeballs are anymore, right? Even RSS is basically dead, right? When it comes to to reading. We used to use Google Reader to subscribe to RSS blogs or some other app that was an RSS reader. So we would get notified at least when a new article was posted, and we didn't have to visit a site that, like to your point, you're not as prolific as you used to be on Building Blog, right? So Building Blog, you maybe post every 6 months or something now, but it could have been any different time frame. It could have been 3 days, it could have been every day, it could have been multiple things a day, right? Different bloggers have different frequencies that they publish stuff, and it was nice to just get notified and not have to go check. And that's not even, nobody goes to anybody's website anymore. Now you kind of have to have just a hookup to social media so that when you post, people get notified, and that's where they see it, and they might go back to your site to read it. Whereas LinkedIn or whatever, people are doom scrolling on LinkedIn, even on LinkedIn, right? And they might see your article there and catch wind that you've published something. But it's a completely different world now, and even with AI now, and just kind of the recent thing that I've seen people trying to do is opt out of getting crawled for AI training stuff, and I mean, this is something that architects are constantly worried about as well, with copyright and ownership of instruments of service and renderings and all this kind of stuff, and being used for training data potentially. And it's kind of a scary world out there right now. How do you feel about all that kind of stuff? Because Google used to crawl our stuff too, and it still does. Like, I don't have a robots.txt file that says don't crawl this. Because I do want to show up in search results, right? And I publish my transcripts for my podcasts on my website and all that kind of thing, because I want to show up and also, the exposure is nice, but also that it provides value when people do search for things. How do you feel about that whole side of things, and platforms and monetization and paywalls and subscriptions? I mean, it's open-ended, so you can take it wherever you want.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a huge question, but I mean, because I agree with you that the industry has changed, and I don't mean the architecture industry, but the field of online writing and of all kind of online content production has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. And I do think that I mean, if you look at, for example, what Elon Musk did with X, aka Twitter, the whole point for people who will pay for the premium subscription is that you'll just put, a 4,000 word post up on Twitter because you have enough space for it now.
Right.
And that's where the eyeballs are. That's where the retweets are. That's where people are who are actually going to read the content. And then also it algorithmically down ranks links out to things like Building Blog or even to LinkedIn or certainly to Substack. There was a famous
they all want native posted content, right?
Yeah, and then Google will do things like, list your website and allow you to show up in search results, but often at the penalty, in my opinion, of having your material stolen for AI to study and that kind of thing. So it really is a different world that is controlled more top down. And it definitely felt way more bottom up, so to speak, back when I started, which was that, you could just start almost like a media empire using a keyboard and owning the copyright of your material, or at the very least, doing sort of copylefts, share alike sort of licenses that were more popular at the time. But yeah, I mean, there's not, and I think this is one of the things that has affected many things have affected my pace of posting on Building Blog, including other professional obligations now. But one of them certainly was that it's just harder. People are substantially less likely not just to go to Building Blog as a kind of that people have just lost interest, but people just don't go to blogs as much as they do anymore. So I mean, the temptation would be, well, I could join, I could start paying for an X account and start putting stuff there, or I could start putting things on other platforms so that more people see them. But it's tough. I mean, I feel like the payoff there is that certainly I don't want to, writing for Twitter or X means that I'm just enriching other people who are profiting off of my material in a way that my own website shouldn't necessarily be something that they make money off of. But at the same time, if it allows me to make money, like am I doing my own self a disservice by not taking money that's sitting there on the table waiting for me to grab it, by not being more flexible in the platforms that I use. But there are a lot of problems with WordPress and the individual hosted blog anyway. But I think a lot of those are more like technical and typographic and user based. There are aspects of WordPress in particular that I really don't like. There were aspects of Blogger that drove me insane, which is why I left it. There are aspects of Substack, having sort of experimented a little bit with Substack that I also don't like. I personally, the entire newsletter idea, I mean, I know it's where everybody is right now, but the one thing in the world I don't want more of is email. And the idea that, I subscribe to multiple Substacks, and some of them are daily, but it's just like, my God, I wake up in the morning and I've got, 12 emails and 9 of them are Substacks. And it's pretty overwhelming, actually. Like, I guess I'm old school enough, but I would rather actually just go to your website and just see what you have there. I haven't been there in 2 weeks, or I haven't been there in a couple days. Like, what's new? I know a lot of people find that too labor intensive, but I think it's worth it personally, and it's better than having my inbox explode with just what feel almost like those notes that used to exist in the 80s. What were they called? Like you'd get a chain letter, and then you were meant to forward it on to somebody else. But right. it just sort of feels a little overwhelming to constantly get everything as an email.
Well, and those 9 Substack emails are book length. Right, like they're not
totally
book length, but they're Cliffs Notes.
They're articles.
They're long,
they're long.
And it's a lot of reading. And I mean, and this is coming from somebody who publishes really long podcast episodes, right? So it's just a different medium. It's kind of it's similar in total output. It's a lot to listen to, and it's interesting to me to think about podcasting as kind of actually being one of the only places where it was like the true intention of the web, which was like it was the Wild West, but it was open and it was yours, right? Yeah. To create that media empire that you mentioned, right? Yeah. And that's what podcasting still is. I don't think Spotify is doing anything to try to help that. I think they're trying to actually hurt that with, right, creating, again, this is they're creating a platform, and they're trying to get you to go to their platform and subscribe to their music, and then you get the podcasting and all those kinds of, and that is against kind of the original idea, just like so many businesses are against the original intention of what the web was about or what podcasting was about. So it's kind of interesting to me that Apple, being the largest podcast directory in the world, hasn't messed that up, right? They haven't intentionally screwed it up and tried to monetize it. They've just kind of been a benevolent overlord of it in some way. So it is interesting to me to kind of think about how this is also another long form way to deliver ideas, content, conversation to people, like writing is on the blogs and on internet. And at least there's a subscription model still with podcasting that works pretty well. And by subscription model, I don't mean pay for, I just mean like to subscribe to be notified when episodes come out. So it's a similar but different, and I hope it doesn't change, because companies are interested in changing it for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting actually just listening to you describe that, because I do think that so many of these super platforms are going out of their way to make sure that you never leave. So if you go to x.com, you'll read this article and then this video, and then you'll watch an entire feature-length film that's been released on X, or documentary, that kind of thing, and so you just never leave. Or same with other social media platforms, or even things like Apple, et cetera, et cetera. But what's interesting is that I think that you could arguably sort of compare that to the growth of things like big box stores that took something like a very specialist butcher, put that out of business by absorbing butchery into the meat department of, say, a Walmart. And then there was, a local clothing store that, was selling quirky T-shirts, but now it's out of business because now Target is selling those quirky T-shirts. But this kind of thing where you get absorbed into a kind of retail empire, and even to the point now where there was a minor, I'm not going to say controversy, but a minor conversation online about a plan for Costco that was they were putting out a new building where, in order to go along with local regulations, had to add housing and residential space to the Costco.
Yeah.
So the idea, though, just to be cynical for a brief moment, although I'm very pro housing and pro dense, walkable urban cores, cynically though, it's like if you actually live at a Costco, or the kinds of apartments now that you can buy that are actually in shopping districts, basically inside shopping malls, it's kind of an extension of this idea that you can never leave the one place that you go into. You're now in the kind of retail superfamily, and I definitely think that that's what X is trying to do under Elon. Where just basically, like you'll have podcasts, you'll have feature films, you'll have, photography, exhibitions, like you'll have live events, everything will be on this one platform. But I do miss that other earlier internet, where you did go to the individual butcher and then this one strange bakery and then this one whatever. Because I feel like that's what it felt like in terms of going to just find individual people's voices, and this is their website. This is how they designed their website. These are the things that they linked out to. It was much more sort of personality based, and I definitely miss that aspect of things where everything feels much more shoehorned into a kind of, even like with Medium, you go to Medium and you can, everything's in the same font, everything looks the same. Right. Or Google's their automated page design thing that they put together about 10 years ago now, but where it just basically made everything look identical. So the New York Times looked exactly like a post on Building Blog, which looked exactly like somebody else's rant about something, which looked exactly like a restaurant writing about a new night that they had coming up. And so the internet became much more difficult to differentiate between types of content, types of voices, and even levels of expertise, where it was difficult to understand what you're getting into. Is this an essay, or is this an op-ed, or is this an advertisement? Right. Everything looked the same, even typographically. And so I think that also, in tandem with decreasing media literacy skills in the general public, I think has definitely led to a lot of the things that we see now, where people just do not know what to trust or who to trust or what to believe. And I don't see a way out of that problem right now. I mean, aside from perhaps completely absurd minor changes, like allowing more visual differentiation between users of major platforms like X or Medium, et cetera, et cetera. There has to be a way to make things that they don't all look like it's just internet mush and you have to read through it and decide what's true. Because I feel like that's the situation that we're in now.
Yeah, it's the lowest common denominator kind of visual templatizing of everything. That Facebook did it, I think, because remember MySpace was totally customizable, and then it was like Facebook was where people were, and it was just the standard layout. You couldn't inject your own CSS code into the boxes and make the flashing headlines anymore, because I mean, at some level, like, it looked really bad on MySpace, but at the same time it was kind of yours. And so Apple's done the same thing with the phone, right? And it was they don't let you do a lot of things because it wouldn't look like a great Apple device if everybody was allowed to do whatever they wanted to it. And so there's like this weird, it's your device, but it's not. You don't get to decide what it looks like, right? It's you can see this kind of all over the place. You can also see it in automobiles, right? Everything's starting to look like a Camry, for example, right? It's like all the cars start to kind of look the same, but there's always kind of that culture of outliers, but it's a very small percentage of people who actually do any of those things. So it could be car customizing, it could be, computers. It could, there are going to be people who still buy and build their own computers and run Linux, right? So
sure, it's a very small minority of people, but
it's a very small minority.
But it's funny. It brings to mind, the famous example of the Gesamtkunstwerk in architecture. Where if Mies van der Rohe is not only designing the buildings, but then also insisting on the placement of window shades and the colors that those window shades can have, so as not to violate the artistic purity of the architectural space or the structure. I think arguably we're just kind of butting up against the kind of social media Gesamtkunstwerk, where everything is being controlled for us, and I don't like the results. So it's kind of funny. I wonder. I don't want to sound like an old man yelling at a cloud, but I do wonder what would happen if I moved into a building where I couldn't change the window shade color due to the vision of the original architect. It's interesting, but I feel like we're in that phase right now of the internet, or a comparable phase, I should say.
Right.
But,
right.
But
yeah. I mean, well, let's shift the conversation to what you do instead of writing on the internet, which is, well, you tell us. I mean, you're writing books, but you have other obligations as well. You're doing a lot of stuff. But there still is this option to write books, right? Physical books, right? And to design the cover of those books and the layout of those books and the typography and the hierarchy visually and obviously the structure of the chapters and all this stuff, so that it really is this standalone bespoke thing, right? I mean, they end up getting mass produced, but it is a design, right? So talk about your author, like where you been, because the last time we talked, you were on the cusp of releasing a book about the pandemic that you started writing, I think in 2016, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah,
so it was pre-pandemic writing. You did and then the pandemic started, and then you were I think you said that it was at the publisher and it was like, okay, now we have to make some changes because a lot of this has happened now and we know more than we did before you started that publishing process. So take us kind of where we've been in the last 4 years since you were on the cusp of publishing your book on the pandemic.
Sure.
Or pandemics, not the pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, specifically, the book is it's about pandemics in the larger sense. It's specifically about quarantine as a spatial phenomenon and how architecture can be used to prevent the spreading of pathogens and diseases between people and animals and plants, which I think is I'm specifying there because I'm trying to show that you can write about architecture in ways that aren't necessarily, stylistic criticism of existing buildings or historical monographs of architects who lived in the past. And I know there are a lot of other types of architecture writing. But you can also look at how architecture plays roles in other fields. And so, the book before that I wrote, A Burglar's Guide to the City, was about architecture in crime and crime prevention. And specifically in the field of burglary, which is a spatial crime because it involves illegally accessing interior space of architecture. And so with the quarantine book, it was looking at architecture as a kind of frontline medium through which we protect ourselves from the unknown. The book came out in 2021. Came out ironically, actually, about exactly a year after our last that conversation that we had, because it came out in July of 2021. And since then, let me back up slightly. So since around the time A Burglar's Guide to the City came out in 2016, a kind of smaller secondary career of mine took off that then became my number one career, which was working in Hollywood for film and TV adaptations of things that I'd written. And so that was gradually kind of growing in the background of all of these things and led to a situation where quite a lot of articles and short stories and even A Burglar's Guide to the City, things that I'd written were getting optioned for adaptation in Hollywood. And it got to the point where I think at one point I had 12 active projects. Hollywood is a funny place, so they'll often option something and not do anything with it. Right. Or they'll take it all the way up to the finish line and then decide, oh, never mind, we're not gonna work on this project anymore. Which is sadly is what happened with The Burglar's Guide to the City TV show. It got all the way up to the final decision about what they were going to release in the fall, and we had the pilot scripts. Anyway, everything was in place, and then it got turned down. Oh. But yes, and then in 2023, a film finally did come out, a Netflix movie based on a short story of mine, and that was exciting. It was really fun. I got to go to the red carpet premiere, and it was a Netflix movie, so it was only in the cinema for literally just one night when they showed it at their own cinema that's here, a specially built place here in Los Angeles, and got to meet the stars, and I knew the director already and that kind of thing. But so that was exciting, and for me, and but so in the last 4 years I've been working still on a lot of short fiction that is now in the adaptation pipeline. I'm working on a new book now, and I'm still doing some reported nonfiction for outlets like MIT Tech Review, Wired. I just had a piece in Financial Times, things like that, looking at different aspects of architecture. Because still, at the same time that I'm diversifying maybe the audience for what I'm writing, I am still writing about architecture. In that sense that even a quarantine book is about architecture, a book about a series of heists is about architecture. Even the story that got adapted into a Netflix film was about a haunted house. So it's fundamentally has an architectural setting or an architectural structure around the idea of the story. And so I think that's going back to the conversation we were having about audience and platform. I definitely think that anybody listening to this should consider not just, it's great to have your writing in one place online, but consider writing in different formats, writing in short fiction, maybe experiment with a screenplay, do reported nonfiction rather than just an essayistic or, just sort of a blog post. Actually get in touch with people and do reporting, quote people, go on first person reporting trips to see things in person and write about them. And those kinds of things, I think, really do open doors in other fields, whether it's documentary film or whether or not it's, feature films like the Netflix movie that I was a part of. But there's a huge audience for writing, and there's a huge audience for ideas, and there's a huge audience for cultural production. But I think it's easy to get frustrated when you put something up on a personal blog and it doesn't immediately catch fire. Well, some of that is because people haven't seen it. You know, it's the wrong audience. You might have an audience, but it's not the right people for getting it into the correct context to get picked up by Hollywood or that kind of thing. But I think that if you're willing to seek out those kinds of audiences and try to figure out ways to write for them or get in touch with people or put your work in front of different audiences, I think the results can be really, really rewarding and fun. And for me, certainly have broadened the horizon of things that I cover and where I cover them and that kind of thing, and for whom I do so. But it's kind of a long-winded answer to that question, but I feel like that's the kind of stuff that's been happening in the last 4 years. So yeah, a lot of a new book, some Hollywood stuff, and some nonfiction.
This episode is made possible with support from AVAIL. AVAIL makes the best software to manage all of your AEC digital content. Dedicated to developing tools that save AEC teams time, AVAIL has now added Revit Application Version Management to its suite of content management capabilities. Once a painful manual process, Revit Application Versioning is now automatic for AVAIL customers. Publishers simply upload files to an AVAIL channel, and the files are automatically converted to newer versions from Revit 2021 through Revit 2025. For users, the experience is then seamless. They can search, select, and utilize the Revit content in AVAIL, regardless of what Revit version they are working in. Inquire about a demo of AVAIL and its new Revit Application Version Management features today at getavail.com/request-demo. My thanks to AVAIL for supporting this episode of the Troxel Podcast. And now, let's get back to the conversation. Interesting. And like, you didn't plan that out in advance, right? It's interesting that what you're saying is you chased some of these interesting ideas and they turned into something that opened a door for something else. And one of the things we talked about in our last episode was this idea of kind of connecting the dots. You see these interesting connections. I mean, the name of the episode was "This reminds me of that," right? Sure. And so you're just constantly observing and noticing, and you see something, and oh, that reminds me of this thing over here, and that reminds me of this. Like the tunnels remind me of the subways, and the inside of this, and the under that. And I think that's really interesting how you're willing to chase those, not knowing where they're going to lead, which I think is kind of like any design problem that's open-ended. It's like a wicked problem, right? You don't know where it's going, and you're figuring it out as you go down that path. Yeah. And to me, like that's kind of what architects are built for, right? Like that is, you're looking for interesting mashups, which I think every time I hear what you're working on, it's an interesting mashup. Like I didn't think of those two things together before, right? And I think it's interesting that the thread that runs through this is architecture. And so we probably talked about this on the last episode, but it's been 4 years. So let's refresh. Like, where does that come from for you? Like, why is that the thread for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I can answer in the specific, I guess, just, for me in particular. I guess I noticed that so much of what I'm interested in can be traced back to architectural or spatial questions. And so, as a child, I was super interested in things like lost cities and the jungle and ancient ruins. And I read a lot of like fantasy and played Dungeons and Dragons. And I was really interested in the lost kingdoms of the past or whatever. But that's fundamentally it's an architectural obsession with lost buildings or abandonment or dereliction. And then similarly, when I got really into science fiction more as a teenager, so much of science fiction is at the very least set in an interesting environment, whether that's an alien planet or a megastructure or some kind of city or a mining camp on an asteroid or that kind of thing. But there's a spatial aspect to science fiction. In fact, often in science fiction, the spatial setting is the thing that makes it clear that it's science fiction. It's set on an alien planet. It could be a novel about a father and a son, but it's set on Mars. It's science fiction. Or it's set on a city on the Atlantic seabed. Oh, it's science fiction. The setting is often it's not just the presence of technology or the fact that it's set in the future. It's also the setting that it takes place in. But so I also began to notice that with things like heist films when I got really into those and crime.
Totally.
that and those overlap quite quickly with things like action movies. But I began to notice that it's architectural. You have people in a heist movie are actually talking to one another explicitly and out loud about how you get from this room to that room. How do we get inside a building without no one knowing?
Some wireframe 3D model that they
totally
can,
exactly. Yeah, I mean it's one of the only genres that you can get away with people looking at blueprints, and it's not boring. It's actually like key to the plot. You want to see those blueprints. It's really difficult to get away with that sort of architectural obsession in a different genre. I mean, other than maybe like a murder mystery where you're trying to figure out how somebody got into that room. And then of course you throw in actual architecture, by which I just mean buildings and the built environment and cities and questions of transportation and, park design and streets and even now things like sea level rise. And then the aesthetic aspects of that as well. Buildings I like, quote unquote, just something as simple as that. The things that I like to see or the buildings that I like to be in spatially and atmospherically. Again, those are all spatial questions. And then things like, other aspects of things that I'm interested in, like warfare and the results of war, such as, refugees and the humanitarian aftermath of conflict. Those are also architectural questions. Where do people go? What was what aspect? How was the destruction wreaked by the people who did it? There are a lot of aspects of those kinds of questions that are spatial and architectural. But so I say all that that I then realized that I could write a site like BLDGBLOG, and it was kind of a magic moment where it switched on over about maybe the first year of writing the blog, first 6 months even, where it just became clear exactly how much someone can cover if they're still focused on architecture. And so I think that the last 20 years really were just exploring that. And so everything from astrophysics to, again, like geology and mining, to, of course, the issues that we were just talking about, social issues of transportation, aspects of historical preservation and archaeology. All of these things can be written about through an architectural lens. It's just right there in the middle of, at least for me, of so many different interests. And for me, that was a great realization that I can actually cover thousands of topics, and it's still on the same website because it's all relevant to the same underlying topic. And so that for me was pretty magical. I mean, I could imagine someone doing that and people have done this, but for music, you could just look at acoustics and sound, and not just music, but just all kinds of different aspects of vibratory energy that results in sonic material. You could do that with arts and art history. You could do it with cinema. I mean, there's any number of different topics that you could take and just figure out ways of looping these other apparently irrelevant topics onto that. It's almost like an embroidery pattern. And but as far as, just to go back to your question, go chasing after something where I don't know where it will go. I do agree that that's something that a lot of architects do as well, because I mean, when you sit down to design a building or think about a house or think about whatever it is that you're working on spatially, you clearly don't know exactly where things are, or how you're going to get from, terminal 1 to terminal 2, or from the first floor to the second floor. All of those things are questions that you solve as you work on the problem. And I find that for me as a writer, and I think other writers do this differently, I really enjoy not knowing where I'm going when I sit down and I start writing about something. And, this reminds me of that. The that's that I just mentioned is often not even front of mind when I started writing about it. It's just that 2 or 3 paragraphs in, I'll remember something or realize, oh yeah, this. Right. And, the older I get, the more I feel like writing for me is kind of the way that you see people, they play Sudoku, or they do other cognitive games in order to try to keep themselves young or keep themselves fresh. Sure. But for me, that's writing. Writing is my way of keeping cognitive connections open, of discovering new ones, of kind of keeping the brain flexible. And I think that can happen in architectural design, certainly. But I definitely think that that's one of the reasons why writing for me is such an exciting practice. It's just a way to consolidate memories and build connections between things and try to remain cognitively attuned to the world in a way that, knock on wood, I can stave off dementia for a few more decades. But it's a good way to keep the brain flexible. And so I think that that's a very long-winded answer to that question. But those are some of the things that were so appealing about BLDGBLOG when I started it, and remain appealing about architecture and writing today in terms of how one can organize one's own interests into something that can be communicated to others.
You and I are very alike when as far I would call you a man of many interests. You have a lot of different interests, and I am like that as well. And I encourage that on my other podcast, ArchiSpeak, to architecture students or people working in architecture. Is like, get away from the desk, get away from the computer, take those vacation days, go do things that you normally like. Don't do staycations, right? Go travel, see things, because it makes you a more interesting person, number one, to have experiences like those, but also those experiences lead back into your projects. Right? Those are things that feed, and you never know when that's going to happen. You never know how it's going to happen. You don't even know why it's going to happen, but it's going to happen. And that, I think, is what makes architecture interesting, because every project is pretty much a team sport, and everybody's bringing that to the team, and you don't know what that is, because every project is an assemblage of a different team typically, right? So unless it's a small office, especially in big offices, teams disperse and they come back together in a different form on every single project, maybe even on different phases of a project. And it's really interesting to me to see, I mean, it happened in school. It doesn't really happen in the real world, where, there's one brief in the design studio and you get 16 different versions of that one brief, right? Because everybody's bringing something different to the table. And I think that's what makes architecture really interesting, when you're solving it's a particular problem that can be solved a million different ways, right? And we're going to solve it the way that we solve it because it is an organic thing. But I think that's what's so interesting, is what people are bringing to it. And so you have a list of interests, right? And you've talked about a few of them, like geology, archaeology, burglary, crime, architecture. You're a photographic enthusiast, right? You do a bunch of different things. You travel, you hike, you get outside. Can you just talk about kind of what are those various things in a better explanation than what I just gave of like the bullet list? But because the things that the main place I follow you now is on Instagram, and this is where I see kind of where you're getting out and you are experiencing things. And I can only assume that, I mean, obviously you love to do that, but it is also informing what you do as a professional.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big question, but I do think that travel is certainly a huge part of the way I sort of keep my batteries charged. It's a big aspect of my life. I don't know some of it is maybe that, I moved around a lot as a kid, so I got very used to showing up in new places. I was going to new schools every four years or so. And I know that other people have moved much more than that. But nevertheless, every 4 years since I was born, I had to show up in a totally different state, go to a totally different school and meet totally different people and figure out a totally different lifestyle. Different regions of the country, different sizes of metropolises, from a tiny rural town to cities. And so I think I've always enjoyed that, showing up in places and meeting people and seeing new things. I was a very enthusiastic budget traveler when I first graduated from college, almost immediately. I'd say about 2 weeks after graduating. I was off to go backpacking. I was in China. I was in all over Europe, and that set a pace that hasn't necessarily flagged. It's easy because my wife and I don't have children or pets, so it's quite easy for us to leave the house and go do things together, and not worry about things like where the kids are going to be or what's going to happen to the dog or the cat or that kind of thing. But I do think that taking the time to see places is super important, especially if one is interested in architecture. Being able to see going into structures and experiencing them. It's really not even a seeing at that point. You're experiencing, you're hearing, you're literally feeling a space, whether or not it's a draft or the temperature inside, or if it's just the fact that the ceiling is 100 feet above you and the acoustics have changed. Just recently I was in Norway for part of reporting for the book that I'm currently working on, which is about archaeology. And somebody gave me a tip to go see this really fascinating museum. It's two brothers, the Vigeland brothers. I think it was the Emanuel Vigeland's museum. The other Vigeland is the brother who designed a sculpture park that is this incredibly weird park in Oslo. Yeah, it's super strange. Incredible. It's kind of homoerotic, but also sort of
Yeah.
a celebration of family and human virility. It's very, very strange. But in any case, the chapel that I went to, and maybe you've been there actually, was his brother's work, where it's very weird. It's a church cathedral, or sorry, it's a chapel, or chapel-like space. It's quite a long walk. I walked there. It was a nice day, so it was about an hour walk from my hotel. But it's in the outskirts of Oslo, and it's when I went inside. What was interesting is that it was so crowded, I had to wait in the lobby before they would let me in. But then eventually, when I went inside, everyone else had left by the time I was standing in there, so I was actually alone inside this place. But so there's very little light. So when you first walk in, you cannot see if there are other people in the room. You can barely even understand what's happening. But the human eye gradually gets used to the darkness quite easily. In fact, amongst creatures, we have extremely good night vision. And then gradually you realize that you're in this huge room that has maybe 40, 45 foot tall ceilings. All of the walls are painted with these weird, almost paganistic sort of writhing bodies. It's all very fertile and very kind of Scandinavian folk horror. It's very, very, very weird. It's almost a Dantean. And as that comes out of the darkness, also, and when I accepted the fact that I was alone, I realized that I could start making strange sounds. And so I got to experience the space acoustically, through little claps or clicking my tongue. In fact, I made a recording just to hear it, because the decay on the sounds was like 7 to 9 seconds long. It was very, very long.
Wow.
And I mentioned that as an example because, you can look at pictures of an interesting chapel outside Oslo, and you can say, wow, that looks really cool. Or you can go to it and you can stand inside of it and you can feel the air and you can listen to the sounds and really kind of, and even just adjusting your eyesight within a space and seeing more detail emerge as your eyes get used to things is a pretty incredible spatial experience. And to be able to do that with other types of buildings, I had a bucket list trip in, I think it was 2019, where I got to go to Cappadocia, which is part of Turkey, where for hundreds and hundreds of years, the Hittites had dug huge underground cities into very soft rock that after it's exposed to air hardens. And so you have these massive labyrinths of underground cities that you can explore. And my wife and I went and just were inside these places for just hours and hours at a time. And then when you go out into the greater landscape, you find hundreds, literally, of abandoned Christian chapels, 99.9% of which have been defaced since they were constructed. But the frescoes are still in there. So you find from one side, it looks like a hill. And from the other side, it's like a broken open geode, which is a hollow rock with crystals in it. But it's a broken open hillside that has an old Christian chapel, with fading frescoes. And then you realize, looking out over the landscape, that you're surrounded by dozens and maybe even hundreds of churches that are just hidden inside hills. Wow. It's an amazing experience. And so, and let alone going to major tourist sites, like going to the Colosseum in Rome, or going to Angkor Wat in Cambodia, or seeing the Great Wall of China, or other large architectural undertakings. But so travel isn't cheap. But on the other hand, you can. When I was fresh out of college, it was quite easy to get student deals. I still have some of my old student IDs that you could get international student identity cards, and get really good discounts on things.
Travel hacks.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's a hugely valuable aspect of things. And then you mentioned hiking. I do think that I know that not everyone is a big hiker, and everyone has different levels of physical ability to do these sorts of things. But to those who are physically able to hike, I do think that it's an incredibly invigorating and exciting way to experience the landscape, to actually be out there. Outdoors, if you go to places like Zion National Park in Utah, or Canyonlands, the architectural forms that are revealed, some might use the word architectonic instead of architectural, which implies human design. But the architectonic forms that are revealed over long term of erosion and uplift and earthquakes and landslides and just like general rainfall over millions of years, you end up with these absolutely beautiful sort of hulking geometric forms that you can walk around, and you can experience the shadows and listen to the wildlife. And it's a really architectural experience. It's a spatial way to engage with landscape. It's a way to bodily invest oneself in the world. And I think all of those experiences are very important. Having said that, other things are also quite important. Like, I think as an architect, or rather for architects, I also just recommend looking outside of the architecture building, not just by going to the Grand Canyon, but literally look at things that are happening in different departments, look in different fields if you're not in school anymore. You might find something quite fascinating if you go to an astronomy conference, or if you go watch a movie about something you didn't realize you were interested in. I often find with a lot of architects who are very pressed for time, as you know, architecture is a notoriously overworked field, that there's a feeling of not urgency, but of lack of time. And so, if you're going to go see a movie, I know many architects who feel like, well, then it should be as architecturally relevant as possible. Or if I'm going to read a novel, it should be a novel that is as architecturally relevant as possible, because I don't have a lot of time to read a murder mystery, or I don't have time to go see this kind of thing. But I find very often, not always, but a very, very high track record of success in going to places outside of the field of architecture and finding something where you're like, oh, wow, I hadn't thought of that from a spatial point of view, or the fact that what they're talking about has to be designed by somebody. Even just an example is in the quarantine book, we went to an agricultural disease research center that was under construction. And, you might think to yourself, what does agricultural disease research have to do with architecture? But we actually got into this conversation with this guy who's designed the building about things that I had just never thought about, like extremely advanced HVAC systems that allow negative pressure disease research labs to maintain negative pressure, so the air is always pumping out of the room. Or no, excuse me, I take that back. The room, it's the other way around. The air is always pumping into the room to keep the pathogen isolated. But it was a building designed to survive being hit by a Category 5 or a Level 5 tornado. And so the idea is that when you have even extreme barometric changes in the atmosphere outside, the internal barometric systems of the building will maintain their own pressure. And the way in which that was maintained and the technical expertise that requires. My point is that is an architectural phenomenon, and it's a technical question. And you wouldn't know that if you didn't necessarily follow, disease research, or for that matter, looking to tornado-proof, cities and structures in the Midwest. But I just think looking outside the box generally makes you realize how little is inside the box. And I think that's a really important lesson, in my opinion, for life in general. Don't assume that your life inside the box is everything, because it's not.
Yeah. Yeah, you really strike me as kind of an explorer or adventurer for sure. And the idea, like some of the pictures that you've posted of your travels in southern Utah through the national parks. Like my wife and I got married in Zion. And that's one of the reasons we chose that space, right? And I've done slot canyons there, and we hiked the Narrows for our wedding party, right? Like that was what we did instead of, doing it at a golf course, right? So, But because it is so architectural, and the national parks of Utah are absolutely incredible,
spectacular.
It's just like they are kind of edifices, right? But they're just natural, and like hiking out to Delicate Arch in Arches National Park, right? It's you go on a journey to experience this thing, and you wait for sunset, and you walk back under the full moon, and it's absolutely incredible to have those kinds of experiences. Yeah. And they do inform the work that we do. I mean, you can't not have it inform the work that you do. And I think it makes for some really interesting ideas to come out of. Who knows where they come out of, right? It's like you can't even explain it. But there's some really interesting work that you've posted on your Instagram where you've kind of done deep dives into geologic illustration, right? And I remember following those really closely because you're kind of unearthing from these catalogs that are out there, right? People have done these really intricate cross-sectional drawings through the earth, and you're relating it back to kind of a spatial nature. Like I think we talked about this in the last episode, right? It's like it's not just the ground that we stand on, right? It's like there's a lot going on under the surface spatially with plate tectonics and with stratification and the bending of all that, and just it's an ever evolving thing as well. It's not static, it's dynamic. And I think to me, maybe you could just explain kind of what that study was that you did, because I'll throw some images here into the video portion of this for those who are interested in seeing what I'm talking about. But the things that you were surfacing, I thought they're really beautiful, scientific, right? They were done for research, but they're amazing drawings. And I think that's what's interesting about the work that you're doing, Geoff, because I mean, you're a writer, but you're also very visual in the presentation of the work that you're doing. And I can see kind of where you're drawing that inspiration from, because you're kind of doing this deep dive into case studies, or again, just kind of chasing a trail down and not knowing where it's going to go, and you're finding some really incredible stuff.
Yeah, the geology stuff was or is just delightful to look at, and I think that some of that goes back to one of those sort of if this then that sort of realizations, which was that, you know, if architects are looking at space through visual techniques like section, and if geologists are doing something similar when they're going to see, say, a road, what's known as a road cut. So when you know, someone built a road through a hillside, you then see what was inside the hillside. So you can see levels of rock, et cetera, the stratification of the rock. You know,
Can I just pause you for 1 second? Because we've talked about this, I think, offline, but like my grandfather was a geologist. We mentioned it in the last podcast, but he did a study in Death Valley of a road cut, and it's a very famous road cut. It's actually published in like one of the top 10 road cuts, like the total geology nerd stuff, right? But it's like number 2 in the top 10 road cuts kind of compendium out there. So it's just funny, like when you bring that up, these are the kind of thoughts that are flooding my mind. Yeah.
That's funny. Well, that right there would be, you know, the top 10 road cuts. That would be a fun architectural project for someone to take it upon themselves to go visit those, you know, go see the top 10 road cuts. There's one I really like that's just north of the city here in Los Angeles. It's right when you're driving into a city over the mountains called Palmdale. But as you drive through, it actually, the cut goes more or less through the San Andreas Fault. You are a little bit off the fault, but it's still a spectacular way to see the kind of like compressed waves of rock that have been jostled and deformed over millions of years by tectonic movement along the San Andreas. But I would definitely say that if that isn't in that list of top 10 road cuts, it should be. But yeah, so I think the realization that geologists are visualizing internal layers of the earth in a way that architects are doing for the internal layers of a building was a really exciting thought process, and led to at one point I was teaching a class at Columbia GSAP that was looking at the San Andreas Fault as a setting, where the idea was for students to design a San Andreas Fault National Park. And it was also there too where I challenged some of my students to develop representational techniques that could be applied to architecture and the earth, so that you could see, you know, what was beneath your feet, but also what was inside a building. And then so when I started looking into these USGS, the United States Geological Survey, these documents and reports that are all uploaded and free. It's one of the reasons why I'm a patriotic taxpayer, because I feel like, you know, we have incredible government services, and I'm a fan of those. But so the USGS has this amazing archive of free geological research that's published, and the ways in which the geologists and the geological illustrators that they worked with figured out how to represent complex landscapes are incredible. And I think that if you could show those or adapt those to an architectural setting, there are things like one of my favorite techniques is called a fence diagram, which is basically you're taking a section not just through one hill or one part of the landscape, you're taking a section behind it and then a section behind it, but then you're also taking sections perpendicular to those. So
it's
you
like
end
a
up
grid.
Yeah,
it's a grid of sections, right?
Totally.
It's
exactly.
Really interesting.
And so, you know, you could imagine a fence diagram, a grid of sections cut through Boston, or, you know, or cut through London, you know, cut through wherever you might want, cut through Cappadocia, the place in Turkey I just mentioned. You know, the things that would be revealed by that would be absolutely incredible. And then also isometric diagrams of mines, maps of mine tunnels, you know, that the USGS has produced, where you'll often have, you know, one layer of the tunnel in one color, one layer of the mine in one color, and then below that, you're looking at a plan of the mine. Below that will be a different color, which will be mine level 2, and below that is a different color, and you end up with these things that almost like you know, sort of you know, abstract art meets a kind of mandala, and you know, just the and then as you know from working in architecture, you know, mentally unpeeling what layer goes where and how they're connected, you know, goes back to the sort of the cognition stuff we were talking about earlier. It's a great way to just sort of keep cognitively flexible, because you understand what you're looking at visually. And I mean, these
you're
tools
decoding
then,
it. right?
Yeah,
You're
exactly. Yeah,
decoding.
you're interpreting
And
it.
it's like using AutoCAD where different layers were just represented with different colors or
Yeah,
different
sure.
elements where you had 7 colors or 8 colors that you would boil everything down to, but you knew exactly what you were looking at just based on the color that the
Yeah.
line was, right?
Yeah. And I think that those kinds of things are beautiful to look at, scientifically communicative, and inspiring in terms of architectural thinking or architectural representation. And so I still have unbelievable quantities of those geological materials. So I should continue uploading them.
You
But
should.
the amount of stuff on the USGS website is unbelievable. And then not only just those kind of 3D mappings, but even just or 3D diagrams, but 2-dimensional maps that have been drawn that show the sort of weird fractal geometric forms that exist beneath our cities. If you follow where the bedrock goes, or where the bedrock changes from one type of rock to another, or where it becomes topsoil, you get these shapes and lobes and outgrowths that look a lot like fractal geometry, but are actually just what's beneath us all the time. And we just don't see it like that because we can't peel away the soil, or for that matter, lift St. Louis up in the air to look into the ground. But that's what's underneath St. Louis, or that's what's underneath Oklahoma. And also I found that many places that are allegedly quite uninteresting, the famous boredom of the American Great Plains. When you look at it in a geologic map, it's actually spectacular. It's an unbelievably interesting place. And it goes to show that if you change how you represent something, you can often change your own level of interest in that thing. So to say that something is boring just means that it's been represented in a boring manner to you so far. And there's a new way of looking at it, and that those ways exist. And so it's also exciting to see the USGS as a kind of a way of changing how we think about representation and how we think about what we're capable of producing in terms of depicting the Earth. But yeah, I mean, I think also then getting in touch with geologists has been pretty exciting. I've spoken with many geologists and plate tectonics researchers, and all of this stuff informs my writing, my thinking. And I certainly think it would be true for others as well, to speak with people outside of your chosen field and get to know even just the vocabulary that those people use. Like a fence diagram. It's an interesting phrase to have in my pocket.
I had not heard of that before I saw that post that you had done. Yeah, and I was like, oh, that I didn't know what that was called.
Yeah, so challenging your students to design fence diagrams of buildings would be quite exciting.
Right. This episode is made possible with support from AVAIL. Along with their newly released Revit Application Version Management, AEC software company AVAIL has added another powerful new workflow feature called Palettes to its suite of content management capabilities. Palettes are user-customized lists of content in AVAIL and can function as a favorites list, as starter content for a specific project, or to drive workflows such as redlining construction details. Customers administrators can add palettes to their accounts through the AVAIL Manage portal page today. Interested in seeing palettes in action first? Request a demo at getavail.com/request-demo. AVAIL helps AECO firms better manage, organize, and navigate information faster. My thanks to AVAIL for supporting this episode of the Troxel Podcast. And now let's return to the conversation. Yeah, you strike me as a very much of an inside out, like the way that you experience things. You like like you said earlier, it's spatial. I think a lot of architects are kind of outside in. We start at a very high level. We zoom in, zoom in, zoom in, zoom in, then we zoom back out, and then we zoom in, and then it's kind of this constant modulation between zooming out and zooming into the big picture and the tiniest details. And obviously there's a spatial component to that, and how all these things come together, and spaces that people inhabit that are the things we actually create. But there's still kind of this aesthetic tendency that we... But you're talking about an experiential, spatial, acoustical, right? Light. Like these are very architectural at the very foundations of architecture. And I think it's so interesting to think about the spatial. They're not buildings, but they're still, a lot of times they're man-made things like mines, like you were talking about, like subways and different ways to convey people and objects through space, and mine shafts with carts, and obviously the shafts part. And it just seems to me like they're so experiential in nature. I think that's really interesting in the way that you even communicated experiencing that chapel in Norway, right? It's very inside first, outside maybe second. I don't know. But the idea of that experience, I think, is really the nugget of this part of the conversation, because you don't get that looking at images, right? You talked about that earlier. You can't just flip through Pinterest or Google, or as it used to be, magazines and books, where in school we would do case studies. It was never the same as going to the place and experiencing it for yourself, and maybe even doing that multiple times. A recent example for me with this was, I had seen images and I had heard other people talk about the African American Museum on the National Mall, right, in Washington, D.C. And that's not the full name of it, but the full name of it is very long, and I don't remember it exactly. So I'll put it in the show notes. But what an experiential museum to visit. I don't know if you've been there or not, but it's I've been to the Guggenheim in New York as well, and that is experiential, right? Like, it's like go to the elevator, go to the top, and then work your way back down. And this one, it was the opposite. It's like go to the bottom and experience the timeline from beneath the ground, dark, and it still gets lighter and lighter, and it's this progression through spaces on the inside is absolutely phenomenal. Like, it blew me away. And it's not something you can take in one visit either, right? You need to go multiple times. There's so much content, there's so much to read, there's so much to think about. I think that it is unfortunate that we are always so pressed for time working on projects, and you don't get to take the time to really build your rapport with space, as it were, right? Doing these things to be able to then take that experience and apply it to your work that you do. I mean, obviously people can choose to do that, but oftentimes it's like that. These are the things that end up on the back burner. But the work that you're doing, it seems like you're very intentional about doing these travels, having these experiences. If you were to kind of lay that out for people, like, how much time are you spending? I'm sure there's a blend, like you're probably working while you're doing this stuff too, but if you were the experience side versus the doing side, like what do you feel like your breakup is there, or the percentages of those?
I mean, in terms of travel specifically, or
just like the experiencing of all of the different things that I see you posting about versus like the actual, like, you're sitting down to write. And if you were to give some numbers to that.
I think that number definitely changes over time. I think that not in one direction, but there are phases of my life where quite a lot of time is spent more reflecting on things and writing about them, whereas there are other times where it's very much more sort of doing centric, so to speak. Where it's about the experience, it's about taking things in. I find that when I'm traveling, one of the things that's so good about, and I like so much about being a writer, is that it's quite difficult to not find something to write about, especially if you're traveling to a location where you're already kind of keyed up to see things, because you're in a different location. You don't know what's going on, so you're noticing more very basic things that people take for granted as part of everyday life seem really exotic and strange. Travel has that effect of heightening your sensitivity to detail. And so if you also go, and that's even for people who aren't writers. So if you are a writer or a photographer or doing anything involving documentation, you'll begin to notice that, wow, I could actually write a piece about this building or about this person or about this place that I visited or this landscape or this historic site. And so it often means that when I'm traveling, I get to see things that I might not otherwise have expected to see, or that I might not otherwise have gotten access to. Because if you get in touch as a journalist in town, often it's much easier for doors to be open to you. And so that's one aspect of this that I like so much. So there's a friend and colleague of mine who I admire, who started an entire organization called the Infrastructure Observatory, because I can't remember this place he was trying to get into, but I want to say it might have been a data center. But the origin story was that he was trying to get a tour of a data center, and they were like, "Why would we give you a tour of our data center? Who are you? Are you with an organization?" And so he came away from that with the realization that all he had to do. Yeah, so he started this thing called the Infrastructure Observatory, and then got back in touch with some of these people and got a group of 4 or 5 other infrastructure nerds together. And all of a sudden he was getting permission to go inside places and see them because they were the infrastructure observatory. So I think that, having a reason to see stuff is definitely good for getting access to those places, beyond just showing up as a tourist, and taking pictures and realizing that how cool it would be if you could see that, but you can't get in because you didn't call ahead or that kind of thing. But yeah, I think it's definitely, with travel too. I mean, I do find that it's not all time off, so I will often have days where I'll be in a great city or I'll be in a really interesting landscape or place, but I have to spend hours in the hotel room working on, either a piece of writing that's due or preparing myself for what I just said, like a tour or an interview that's coming up later that day. And so, it's not always, it feels a little silly, like you spent all this money to go to halfway around the world and you're sitting in your hotel room for 5 hours. But that's the trade-off, is that you have to get the work done and actually do this stuff. And so it's a mix of, business and pleasure, I guess you could say. But speaking of the African American Museum, though, I mean, one of the things that blew me away spatially, specifically and only in terms of spatial, is just how much larger it is inside than it appears to be from the outside. It's astonishing, actually, because even I've been back to DC several times since I was in there, and every time I drive past or walk past, it's always amazing to me because it does not look like a large museum. But it's an absolute cavern. It's enormous. So it's a nice, that alone is a nice architectural trick.
I knew you would like it because of the underground nature of that.
Well, any basements.
It's big underground. It's bigger than the footprint that is above ground, from what I can tell. I haven't studied any drawings, but that's my sense of it. It's kind of like the Griffith Observatory, right? It's like you go into the planetarium, you go down below, and you're underneath the front plaza. It's kind of similar to that. Yeah. It's very cool. There was something I was going to ask you about there. I'm trying to remember what it was.
We were talking about travel and workload and doing versus experiencing.
Oh yeah, I will echo what you're saying about starting the infrastructure observatory. That's what a podcast will get an architect as well. I mean, basically, I am a member of the press by having So I don't even know what the time frame would be, but I obviously been doing this for a while, so I don't necessarily want to hinge it on a long-standing podcast, but I would assume also with Building Blog and things like that, like all of that helps, right, to be able to then apply for press credentials, because I mean, whether you talk about it or not, like you're still a member of the press, right? And you then have opportunities to do things that the general public doesn't necessarily have access to. And so I would encourage people again to, like, if you come up with reasons to talk about this stuff, come up with reasons to write about this stuff, come up with reasons to draw these things, and just put a name behind it, and you can also do the things that Geoff is talking about. It's firsthand experience. It's great. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And those opportunities would not be available, and nor would I have foreseen them in any, and I still don't, right? But they do show up, and I think it's absolutely fantastic to have that ability to access those things that other people can't.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I think that, we live in a time where other people might be more inclined to take the influencer route, so to speak, where, you hear such nightmarish stories where somebody, as an influencer, I'm an influencer, I'm going to depict your hotel room. So can I get a free week in this hotel? Or, I'm going to upload a picture of my dinner to Instagram. So can I get 50% off the bill? Being an influencer purely to just get free crap from places, I think is definitely not the right way to go.
Right.
But I think that, having something like a podcast or a blog or a newsletter, or even if you're just a journalist for someone else's platform, you can still get access to places that you wouldn't normally get into. I mean, I clearly don't recommend that you take advantage of that and, put people out of time by pretending that you're going to cover something that you're not going to. Yeah. But I do find that, it's an extremely useful and great way to learn more about places. And also I find people are very generous. I think that we live in a funny time, but I do feel like people they do want to share their experience in their life and their everyday environment and the things that they do for work. And I often find that, when I'm working on an article in particular, people who do such interesting work that I can't believe that they're not inundated with requests to speak to the press, or like they're practically like superheroes in my mind, but they're people working on random scientific problems, or people working in architecture offices, or archaeologists doing something with technology. like in my opinion, they're celebrities, and I can't believe they even will take the time to reply to me over an email. But then I meet them and we talk, and you realize that not a lot of other journalists have reached out to that person, you know, or not a lot of other people have actually expressed interest. And I think as you'll find, I'm sure anyone listening to this podcast will have found, often your own family and friends are a little tired of hearing your shtick. And so, you know, they don't want to hear it either. And so, you know, you might be the most interesting archaeologist in the world, but maybe your spouse is just tired of hearing about it, and doesn't want to talk about that anymore. That's just work stuff. Right. So when a journalist or a blogger or a podcaster shows up and wants to actually learn about and cover these things, I think that it's actually pretty refreshing and exciting for many people, and just kind of adds to a feeling of human camaraderie that is lacking when you're sitting at a terminal all day, you know, just you know, in a dark room, you know, where you're not interacting with people, and you've got headphones on and you're staring at a monitor. You know, I think it's easy to lose a sense of human companionship and the idea that, you know, there are other people out there that are excited to know you and talk to you, and to have you around. I think that's just a really refreshing thing to be reminded, especially after the last 4 weird years of COVID and post-COVID. But
my 18-year-old son, you know, has a hard time striking up conversations with people. And it's because of the way that he approaches it. It's like, what can I tell them about me? And I said,
oh, yeah, sure.
Don't do that. I said, ask about them. Like,
Yeah,
your
totally.
job is to learn as much as you can about. There's something interesting and unique and mind-blowing about every single person out there, and you have no idea what it is. Your job should be to try to figure out what that is about every single person you meet. Because I guarantee you, like, it's something that will blow you away. Like, you just have no idea what people have under the surface. Yeah.
It's funny too, because I don't mean to give a more cynical reason for that, but it's also easier.
Yeah.
You know, I find that if
that's why I told him.
Absolutely agree with what you just said. But in addition to that, if you can't convince your 18-year-old son, I would just say it's a lot easier, man. Like, if you go to a cocktail party and you don't know what to say, like, just ask questions. You could be there for 3 hours, and also people will then remember you as a really fun person because you asked them questions.
Yep.
And like, oh, that person was really interested in me, and they'll, you know, it's a. But yeah, if you aren't feeling social, I feel like that's the other thing to do, is just start asking people what they do. Oh, did you grow up here? You know, what are you working on now? You know, have you, you know, like, they're just stupid little small talk questions.
Yeah.
That allow you to actually just sort of not have to come up with something interesting to say. And I find that 80% of cocktail party banter for me is that, you know, it's just asking people things about what they do. But I agree that then you get to the less cynical stuff, which is like, yeah, you actually learn genuinely interesting things. I mean, there's so many things that I've written about or think about or have popped up again in my work or in my life are just random throwaway comments from someone who had a bizarre line of work or had a strange experience, or was going through something with their family that it just was so dramatic and bizarre that I still think about it. And then that's where the non-cynical value of talking to people is. It's just fascinating to realize what other people are going through. And especially when you realize too, that like if you're going through a bad spot and then you realize that other people are too, or that they've gone through that and they've come out of it, it's also just a way to remind yourself that you're not alone and you're in the difficulties of life, because there are many of them. And it's easy to get that feeling that somehow you've been singled out for like suffering or badness, but it's just not true. You know, life is a very difficult, constantly aggressive, sort of threatening environment to be in. And it can be reassuring to know that other people experience that too, but that's a different conversation. So I'll just leave it at that.
I'll give an example of this wild phenomena, right? And this just happened like 2 days ago. I met a guy down the street at a outdoor food place, and I'd follow him on YouTube, and I was like, hey, I recognize you. He's like, oh, cool. Nice to meet you. You know, I'll follow you back. And that was it. It was just like this. So then I started looking through his videos on Instagram, and I see him doing a 50-mile trail run with another guy that I'm familiar with, an acquaintance of. And so I then see that guy that he's running with. And I was like, oh, I saw you in a video with this ADU guy. And I was like, so you're a endurance runner. He's like, I had no idea that he's an endurance runner. Well, it turns out that he ran the Pacific Crest Trail in 51 days straight.
Oh, good Lord.
Record holder. Like, this guy is a better than Olympian quality runner. And I had no clue. And I found this out. And then now I'm doing the research, right? I'm like, look, I look it up. It's on the fastest known time website. They're producing a documentary about it. And he ran the Pacific Crest Trail from the border of Mexico in the U.S. to the border of Canada in the U.S. in 51 days straight, no rest days, 50 to 60 plus miles per day of running. Fully supported just by his wife and kids in an RV, right? So some days he's off on the trail in a bivvy, just, in a very small pack, but this guy just goes and goes and goes and goes. And I had no idea, right? And how would have, I was like, hi, I'm Evan. Hi, I'm Timothy. Oh, you're a runner? I'm not a runner. I don't care about running at all, right? but I asked him about his running, and it led to this. Just he blew my mind with what he's capable of, and I thought that was such and I know I get to tell it to you on this podcast. I just thought it was so interesting that like all of the conversation led here. But anyways, really interesting. So Geoff,
it's incredible.
Yeah, it is. So tell us what's next for you. We'll start to wrap up the conversation here. But what are you mentioned you're working on another book. Obviously you're doing other things too, but give us an idea of where you're headed in the near future.
I guess I'd say in the near future, I still have a couple active Hollywood projects. So fingers crossed, knock on wood, do whatever it takes to get these. One's a TV show and one is a feature film. But they're still plugging away, and I'm optimistic. But they're based on 2 short stories of mine, so it's based on fiction. And then just again in the near future, then I'm working on this archaeology book, which has been absolutely a blast in terms of reporting. For me specifically, archaeology was when people ask you what you thought you were going to be when you were 7, or 9 or 8 or whatever the question might be. For me, it was an archaeologist. I was just totally fascinated, by abandoned cities and ruins and temples and artifacts. Everything about it just blew me away. So for me, it's also just exciting to be covering a topic that I'm excited about. But it's also architectural, so it's specifically looking at different ways of representing the past of and buildings that are no longer standing, but they are still present to be used the right instruments. And so I just got back from a long trip in April where I was hanging out with geophysicists who have designed experimental electrical devices that can see through the floors of cathedrals. Wow. There were some people that are working on an autonomous ground vehicle that can find Viking settlements. Wow. Buried Viking settlements. And that's on top of some research I was doing for the same project a couple of years ago, where I met a guy who wants to basically start a kind of European space agency, but that's looking down instead of up. So it'll be a terrestrially focused, archaeologically informed subsurface agency. So I'm putting all that together into one book, and I still have some travel and some telephone interviews in some cases just to clarify some details. But I've just seen some devices and machines in person that blow me away. I've met amazingly interesting people who, again, in my opinion, are celebrities. And I met them, and they were like, "Oh, yeah, no one's asked us, there are not a lot of journalists who are interested in what they're doing." But so I'll be working on that for the next probably year and a half, and some more short fiction that I hope is coming out soon. And then, of course, like personal travel that I don't think will be too interesting to the listeners of your podcast, but trying to stay busy and succeeding at least at remaining busy. And we'll see. I don't know if I'm succeeding at success, but we'll see how that goes. So,
from the outward looking in, it looks like you're having a great time, and that to me looks like success. I have to imagine that you're a fan of Atlas Obscura.
Oh, yeah, sure, of course.
Yeah. That just seems like that's a great. Just for anybody who doesn't know what that is, it's a fantastic website, and there's book version as well. But if you are ever traveling and you want to take the road less traveled and find the ruins that exist that have just been kind of forgotten about or neglected, it is an amazing resource to find cool stuff that is kind of in the realm of what we've been talking about in this episode.
Yeah. Briefly, I don't know if there'll be time, but I also just want to say, just plug very briefly, my wife is also a writer and just put out a new book. It came out about 4 weeks ago. But it's called Frostbite, and it's about how refrigeration has changed food in cities and that kind of thing.
Oh, nice.
But I mention it because even though it's about basically the science of food preservation, and there are so many urban and architectural takeaways and sites of interest in the book. Everything from ice caves that used to be used and pits where snow and ice would be stored, natural snow and ice would be stored with food to keep them fresh over long periods of time. To the point where actually one archaeologist has a theory that one of the reasons why there are so many myths of little people living around the British Isles, hobbit-like creatures and folkloristic creatures, is actually because ice caves, used to be, carved into a hill with a tiny door that was just enough to reach in and take snow and ice and put some food in. And so you'd have little hills all over the British Isles with tiny doors in them. They sort of looked like Middle Earth.
Right.
But we got access to places again that, just to continue this theme, that blew me away. Like there are caves and mines all over the Midwest, especially in Missouri, that have been turned into gigantic food storage facilities.
Oh wow!
And so like the nation's frozen pizza is basically inside mines and outside St. Louis.
Seriously?
And these places are huge. So we drove around for not hours, but for 20 to 25 minutes, just driving around in a Tacoma. With these huge pillars holding up the Earth's surface above us.
Underground.
And then just underground. And then 5 to 6 floors of shelving holding craft cheese and ice cream and all basically the nation's food supply, is being held inside these huge artificial caves and mines in the American Midwest. But so I could go on for great detail, but it's a great book and it's exciting, and it's also evidence that even something like refrigeration is going to have architectural implications, and you can still come back to that spatial question, and that architectural question, really does underlie almost everything. And that's just one major takeaway I would say to anyone listening.
I will definitely be checking that out. And if you could just say her name and the name of the book one more time, and I will include it in the show notes so people could just click. But
sure, it's called Frostbite, and it's by Nicola Twilley.
Nice.
I can text it to you as well.
Okay, sounds good. I will put links to Building Blog on there and your Instagram. Is there anywhere else where people can follow along with what you're working on?
For now, I'd say that's probably good. I do have an X/Twitter account, but I don't really use it. And I've been playing around with Substack, but it's not really architecturally relevant, ironically. It's just like me randomly writing crap. So, I'm not sure I want to institutionalize that yet. But I'd say, Building Blog and Instagram, I think are good places to go.
Fantastic. Well, Geoff, thanks so much. This was great catching up with you. I know we went all over the place with this conversation, but I think it was well warranted. This was so many fun, interesting things to talk about here. I couldn't not do it. So, and congrats on 20 years of Building Blog. That's an incredible milestone. And if you could post a little more often than every 6 months, I'll just put in a vote, because I love the content that you put on. The latest article that you posted right around the 20-year anniversary is absolutely fascinating. Like, it's just, and we don't need to spoil it. I would love it if people would actually go to your website and read this article and see the incredible imagery that goes along with it. It's really fascinating stuff. And so if you're interested in the conversation that we've had today, you will definitely find Geoff's articles just as interesting. So thanks so much for hanging out today.
Thanks for having me back.
Thanks to our sponsors, and thanks to our members this week. Find out how you can become a member at trxl.co, and I'll talk to you again next week.